part of this introductory class on energy empires. I think most of us should have met at some point or other, at least during the introduction to the study program, but I recognize some of your faces from my classes, so maybe also in other contexts. I'm Alexander Libman. I'm professor of Russian and East European politics here at Osteuropa-Institut. And what I decided to talk about today is a question which I believe should definitively be asked if one wants to ask the general question about energy empires in Eastern Europe. Now, the whole class, and I haven't attended most of the lectures, I mean, none of the lectures so far, but I know the program, and the general premise of what we're talking about here is, in a sense, that energy and focus on energy, energy dependence, energy as a factor of political transformation, of economic development, is absolutely essential for Eastern Europe. And here, I guess, quite a substantial focus would be made on Russia, which is traditionally seen like a petrocracy, a state for which energy, export of energy, particularly oil and gas, is of crucial importance for the national economy. And I think when you all were confronted with the main premise of this class, and it's not just the premise of this class, I don't know whether Robert Kindler told you about this at the beginning of the class, this is also a premise of a larger research group our institute is now applying for. You didn't ask the question whether this perception of Eastern Europe and of post-Soviet Eurasia has always been one which people accepted so naturally without debate. And as a matter of fact, it's not the case. So if you looked about how Soviet Union was discussed about, and that was just 30 years ago, there were very few who explicitly considered this country an energy empire or a petrocracy. Although Soviet Union was a major exporter of oil and gas also to the Western European economies, the country was not at all perceived as one crucially depending on the energy sector, and was seen as substantively different from countries for which energy was indeed the backbone of their economy, like, I have no idea, Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, those with which Russia is currently all the time compared with. Soviet Union was seen as a country with the backbone of modern industrial complex, potentially suffering under all the drawbacks of the planned economy, and a country with substantial scientific potential. If you want, a country very different, very distinct from countries of the global south to which the traditional energy exporting economies belonged. So here we are 30 years later, and we look at this part of the world from an entirely different lens. Now we really focus on energy to understand politics and economy of Russia. So the question is, what has happened during this period? And there are at least two explanations. One of them, and this is one which has traditionally been used first by left-wing forces in Russia, but today also occasionally by the Russian leadership, is that mistakes were made in the 1990s, which kind of destroyed all these industrial capacities and scientific potential, and ultimately led to the current state of the world. Another explanation, and this is the explanation I want to pursue with you today in this class, is that possibly the way how we thought about, the way how we studied Soviet Union missed the point that the country already at that moment of time was de facto a petrostate. And I'm going to demonstrate to you why we potentially missed this point. And I think it will be a very instructive way of thinking about both the Soviet past and also how we study Eastern Europe in general. In short, my main argument is going to be that the Soviet Union, being a petrostate, but being at the same time a planned economy, in a sense, used the revenues from the oil and gas export precisely to convince the world and itself that it's not an oil and gas dependent country. And it was very successful in this respect, so that the Soviet leadership until the very end didn't see itself as a primarily energy dependent state. And even today, the image of the good Soviet Union remains an important factor of the Russian politics. And for me, it will be also a story of how we study these type of systems. At least some of you I recognize from my class of interdisciplinarity. They will have heard a thing or two, which I'm going to tell you now in this lecture. That is that while studying certain areas and focusing on collecting primary data, on getting better understanding of how these areas work, we, in many cases, turn to be much farther away from understanding these areas than if we focus on bigger theoretical explanations. Essentially, by focusing at the facts, we may miss the general picture, and this is exactly what could have happened with the Soviet Union. So, this is essentially the premise of this lecture. If you want, while you are here to talk about energy empires, my question is, why didn't we talk about energy empires 30 years ago? And what was our mistake in understanding the Soviet Union at that moment? And I'm going to structure this lecture along three main blocks, three main arguments. The first one is going to look at the general dependence or development of the energy dependence of the Soviet economy, and ask the question, insofar the Soviet economy indeed can be seen as industrialized rather than energy dependent. The second part will be about Soviet science, and insofar Soviet Union can be seen as scientific superpower. And the third part is going to be about how we studied Soviet Union and how we missed the facts which I'm going to present in the first two parts. And let me start maybe with the very beginnings, with the discussion of the perception of the Soviet Union during the late 1980s, during the peak of the Sovietology shortly before the Soviet Union collapsed. So, the look at the Soviet Union at that moment of time was very clear. We have a country which has very high rates of urbanization, which increased over the 70 years of the communist rule. That's, by the way, empirically correct. Soviet Union towards the end had urbanization rates which were substantially above 70%, which is way more than the Russian Empire, which was primarily an agrarian rural society. It is a country with high education levels, which systematically improved over time. It is a country which, at least in some areas, was perceived as technologically superior to the world, going back to the advantages of the space exploration of the 1960s, but even the 1980s, surveys among Western scientists systematically showed that the average response was Soviet Union, at least in some sciences, in some scientific areas, is absolutely competitive and unique. And from this point of view, Soviet Union is entirely different from the countries of the global South. And if we, in fact, went just 40 years before that, to the 1960s, I think at that moment of time, we would have all the reasons to say that this difference indeed is supported by the data. In the 1960s, Soviet Union didn't look like a petrostate at all. Soviet Union exported only about $1 billion of oil per year, and only about 1/4 of Soviet export was actually oil. At that moment of time, gas didn't really play a substantial role. I'm really sorry, this is the first time I'm doing it in my whole educational career, but I am going to do it. May I ask you to share what you're talking about? Thank you very much. I'm really sorry, that's really the first time in 20 years of teaching. I hope for your understanding. Thank you. All right. So let me come back to the topic I'm discussing here. So 1960s, the Soviet Union has extremely small energy export And from this point of view, the Soviet Union even appears to be strikingly different from the Russian Empire. As you remember, Russian Empire was among the major oil exporters prior to the revolution, primarily because of the Baku oil fields, which were among the first to be discovered and to be actively used. And then over time, Baku oil fields were depleted, but what's also more important than that, Soviet economy itself changed. Russian Empire didn't have strong industrial capacity. Soviet Union after the 1930s certainly had. It's not my question to discuss whether the strong industrial capacity of the Soviet Union was achieved in the optimal way. Actually, for this, we have empirical research. Guriev has a nice paper on that, which clearly shows that it's not the case. Soviet industrial capacity was rather hampered than really supported by the way to which Soviet Union was industrialized. But what's important for us is the result. The Soviet Union in the 1960s is a heavily industrialized country, which, as a matter of fact, experiences the shortage of energy resources. So it's much closer to what we would see today in the Western industrialized world than to what we talk about when we look at modern Russia. And throughout this whole period, the Soviet Union, as a matter of fact, is much closer to the champion, to the field in which we would not expect Eastern Europe to be leading today in the area of renewable energies. The original strategy of the Soviet Union to deal with the shortage of energy and electricity supply was to focus on hydropower. Given the enormous surplus of rivers in Siberia. And as a matter of fact, the discovery of the oil fields in Western Siberia, which actually turned the situation for the Soviet Union, would have been impossible if one of the hydropower plants, which were in preparation at that moment of time, and Khrushchev actually argued that the construction has already been decided, would have actually been constructed. Because then the areas of future oil fields would just be flooded. And they would have never been discovered, possibly, which would indeed create a very different country, I guess. So, Soviet Union of this period really is not an energy state. And it becomes an energy state not because of the wise decisions of the Soviet government. It becomes an energy state more or less by coincidence, because at a certain point of time, the giant oil reserves and oil discoveries are made in the Western Siberia. To show you how difficult for the Soviet Union was to actually include these oil discoveries into something economically meaningful, just one quote of the then chairman of the Gosplan is helpful. Here, looking at the maps, which already show you their investigated deposits, calls them provincial fantasies, and points out that people in Western Siberia should stop talking about it and should just get to work. So first of all, Soviet government doesn't believe that there is enough oil in Western Siberia. Second, Soviet government doesn't believe that it has a necessary capacity to use this oil in an economic way, because of course Western Siberia is not the easiest environmental, has not the easiest environmental conditions, right? Essentially, half of the year you can't work there because of the war environment, so it's very difficult, very expensive. Third, the whole Soviet planned economy had problems with discovering something even good, which was not in the plan. The Soviet economy was already structured in a way that an energy problems took particular approaches, and the fact that you all of a sudden find oil discoveries doesn't change that. And finally, of course, everybody in the Soviet economy has the same incentives, and these are the planned economy incentives, which are in all cases leading to you behaving in a suboptimal way. For example, the exploration of oil was significantly delayed by the fact that there were no incentives to make substantially deep drills. Because deep drills are more time-consuming, more expensive, and don't allow you to fulfill the plant quota within the given amount of time. So you don't do that, and obviously without deep drills, effective exploration is impossible. In any case, in spite of all these problems, which essentially lead to a year-long delay in exploring Western Siberia, At some point of time, exploration and economic exploration of Western Siberia actually starts. And at that moment of time, the Soviet Union has an entirely different vision for these oil fields than the one we would think about if we talk about petrostate. So how does a petrostate work? They make a giant discovery somewhere. So I don't know, you have in an offshore region of Cyprus, a giant discovery of oil fields. What do? You either create your own oil company or you invite foreign investors to start drilling there and they start exporting oil. And because of the revenues from the oil export, you then, I mean, depending upon the fantasy of your political leadership, buy luxury goods, buy commodities, buy consumer goods, invest in education, or start a war with your neighbor. Soviet Union didn't have any of this in plans. Rather, the main task of this oil was to cover the demand of A, the Soviet industry, which was a desperate demand for energy resources, and B, of Soviet consumers, because Soviet Union at that moment of time was planning the increasing use of automotive transportation in the country, the use of cars, which was of course necessary, making the gasoline necessary. For gasoline, you need oil, right? So the Soviet Union is massively dependent on oil production, but not for the external purposes, not as an energy empire. Soviet Union requires these resources for domestic development. Do we have a country which behaves like this in the modern world? As a matter of fact, we do. There is one major energy exporter, which is an energy producer, which is never mentioned as an energy empire example anywhere. That's the United States. Because the biggest demand for the United States energy resources comes from the United States themselves. So that's exactly the vision the Soviet leadership has at that moment of time. And over time, things are changing. And they're changing primarily because of external shocks the Soviet Union doesn't expect at that moment of time. So again, in the 1960s, after years of delay, the big oil fields of Western Siberia are explored. And a couple of years later, the world is hit by the major energy crisis. Because of the war in the Middle East, because of the blockade by the Arab countries. And at that moment of time, increasing the exports of oil and later gas becomes a very attractive strategy for the Soviet Union. Soviet Union starts what at that moment of time, the United States call energy offensive. And you see already in this language that this was something what the government in Washington was very much concerned about, because they saw it as a way for the Soviet Union to increase its power, to increase its influence. And we know that for many instances, the United States actually tried to block the construction of pipelines going to Western Europe. However, Soviet Union becomes an energy empire almost by coincidence. And this happens because of a combination of two factors: the discovery of these oil fields and the greater demand for energy in Western Europe. Still, as late as in the 1980s, only about 1/3 of oil production in the Soviet Union is actually exported. I'll give you a point of comparison. In 1950s, it's about 3 to 4%. So 96% is domestic consumption. In the 1980s, it's 1/3, but still 2/3 are consumed domestically. This 1/3, however, accounts for about 50% of the revenues the Soviet Union receives from its exports. And because of that, now Soviet Union slowly but surely turns into a state for which export of oil and later gas is indeed of crucial importance. A side note, which I have to make already at this stage, of this oil which the Soviet Union is exporting, at least a substantial part is going to the Comecon countries. That means Soviet Union doesn't earn any hard currency for that. And it's actually not so clear at all which importance does this export have from the economic point of view for the Soviet Union, because the whole exchange rates and the score prices in the Comecon are artificial. They're results of bargaining, they're results of negotiations between Comecon countries, and because of that, it's not quite clear whether the Soviet Union in any way benefits from these exports. But still, the exports which go to Western Europe are substantial enough to generate the substantial hard currency revenues. So this picture I've taken from the study by Clifford Gaddy and Barry Ikes, who are among the most thorough students of the impact of oil and of oil revenues on the Soviet and Russian economy. And what you see here is so-called oil rent, oil and gas rent, to be more specific. The black part are the oil rents, the gray part are the gas rents for the Soviet and later for the Russian economy. Now, the rents obviously depend upon the cost of exploration and of the prices which you have in international markets. And for me, the important thing here is to say that before 1970s, as you see, the oil and the gas rents are relatively small, and the big jump happens only here. And what is also very important, even during the hard time of the 1990s, that's all comparable US dollars, 2011 US dollars. The oil and gas rents the Soviet Union ever received have never been big enough. And this is the billions US dollars. And you should think about it. Here we talk about Russia, which is a smaller country than the Soviet Union. So during at no moment of the Soviet history, the oil and gas rents were as large compared to the economy of the Soviet Union as they were for the Russian Federation, which would later really become massively dependent on the oil exports. Okay, in any case, Soviet Union is exporting oil and gas, and the question is, what does Soviet Union do with the revenue it receives from the oil and gas? And here comes the specific feature of the planned economy. Soviet Union, unlike most other petrostates, doesn't direct the revenue for consumer goods. Consumer goods, of course, play a certain role, especially in the agricultural sector, where the Soviet Union becomes one of the major importers of grain in the world economy. But the most important thing which the Soviet Union does is to subsidize domestic industry. It subsidizes domestic industry either directly. You have hard currency. This hard currency is used in Europe to buy machines, to buy equipment, to buy technology, to implement the Soviet production lines. Or indirectly, Soviet companies, Soviet enterprises, which anyway have soft budget constraints, they don't really need to care about being efficient in economic production, don't need at all to be energy efficient in any way. The energy efficiency is every time taken away as a major objective the Soviet economy has to achieve, simply because it is always superseded by the discovery of a new major oil field. And that's exactly the first argument I wanted to make. The Soviet Union creates a major industrial economy, which over time remains more and more dependent on these direct and indirect subsidies to energy exports. But this is precisely the reason why the Soviet Union is not perceived as an energy-dependent economy, because everybody is looking at the product of this output, this specific industrial sector, which the Soviet Union created. In market economies, the industrial sector of the sort would simply die out. That's the Dutch disease. It means that the uncompetitive industrial sectors will disappear and will be replaced by the focus on extractive industries. In the Soviet Union, they don't die out, they actually flourish at the expense of the rest of the economy. And this leads to this paradoxical situation that you have, if you want, a sandcastle, which no one is thinking about and which everybody believes is going to be the foundation for the new economy after the Soviet Union collapses. But what happens after the Soviet Union collapses? The first thing is the Soviet Union collapses at the moment when the oil prices go down. That means the energy revenues anyway become smaller. Second, I don't want to say that the internal subsidization of industry disappeared after the end of the Soviet Union. Actually, it never disappeared, at least in form of subsidization of energy consumption of households, which of course has something to do with the consumer demand, and in terms of cheap energy for industrial enterprises. But it doesn't exist anymore in the forms in which it existed before, during the Soviet Union. The government doesn't maintain their inefficient, uncompetitive industries at any cost, and a more efficient way of using resource rents emerges. The resource rents are brought into the country and then paid to buy consumer goods from abroad, or even to borrow money from abroad. That's the model we had in the 2010s. And because of that, the country, which was a hidden petrostate in the 1980s, turned a very open petrostate in 2010s. Maybe as a final side note, what does Putin's government do at this moment of time? As a matter of fact, it repeats something very similar to the Soviet Union, although on a different ground. Putin's government starts the import substitution program. Import substitution requires larger and larger production within the Russian Federation, regardless of whether it's economically efficient or not. Part of the import substitution is achieved through the localization requirements. That is, foreign exporters are required to set up production in Russia, and they are able to access Russian market only if a substantial part of value they produce is actually produced in Russia. The automotive, which flourished in Russia, flourished precisely because of this localization requirements. So essentially, the Russian government is also trying to transfer the logic of we're earning resource rents and we're paying for this to consumer goods, for we're earning resource rents, but we create incentives for foreign companies to move to Russia and to actually produce to Russia. After the sanctions are introduced, all of these companies are leaving Russia. As you know, the Western automotive producers are all out of the country. And what happens? Russia moves again back to the old approach. We are exporting oil and gas, and we are buying consumer goods, this time from China. So if you want, the Soviet Union was way more successful than any other petrostate in trying to hide its petrostate nature, but ultimately it turned out to be completely disastrous for the Soviet economy. Okay. What about another side of the story? So the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union, as we have seen right now, was not necessarily a product of real strength of the Soviet economy. It was made possible by the dependence on the energy exports. What about another side? The side of Soviet Union being a scientific superpower. The situation is a bit paradoxical. Kandrovich in 1993 published an interesting paper on that, where he's comparing two indicators. One of them is already mentioned surveys of Western researchers who are asked to say whether they believe Soviet Union is a great scientific country or not. And another part was the cytometrics, which at that moment of time was already emerging, the citation rates of Soviet scholars. And the picture was entirely different. In their scientometric indicators, the Soviet Union didn't at all appear as in any way successful scientific country, while in the overall perception of the Western observers, Soviet Union science was competitive. And at that moment of time, various explanations for that were developed. One of them, and you would imagine that, was secrecy, of course. The argument that Soviet Union has the strong scientific potential, but this scientific potential is not disclosed to the outside world. It's hidden from the outside world. And because of that, we don't see it in the publication rates. It's partially true. Soviet scientists were restrained in their ability to publish internationally, but only partially. And then all sorts of explanations were given there. I think the most fascinating one is the so-called paper crisis the Soviet science experienced. The thing is, at some moment of time, the Soviet government massively incentivized the development of the scientific sector, created positions in academia, new research institutions, and then they found out that for these people to produce their output, they need paper. Yeah, what do we all scientists do? We have paper, today computers, but then paper.
and we fill this paper with symbols. Yeah, and a perfect example of how planned economy works, paper was in short demand. There was not enough paper. What does it mean? Soviet journals had to issue fewer issues and volumes, and the backlog of papers became bigger. Now papers meaning scientific papers. So the hard constraint of lack of paper made Soviet science invisible. Okay? So this is however only partial explanation for that. So in any case, the West believed that Soviet science had a strong potential, and as a matter of fact, even today, the perception of the Soviet science is, in Russia at the very least, as one which at least was able to flourish, had it existed in different conditions. What I'm going to argue here is that the strength of the Soviet science, even if it was indeed there, was, as for the Soviet industry, an artifact of a very specific set of incentives the planned economy produced, and also partially linked to the petrostate nature of this economy, to the fact that it massively exported its natural resources and used the revenues, among other things, to finance scientific potential. But, and this is going to be my second point, the organization of the Soviet science was self-destructive. The position the Soviet science had in the Soviet society was inevitably leading to the demise of the science as a specific social institution and social phenomenon. So let me, because of that, give a brief discussion of how the Soviet Union looks in terms of scientific production. And here the point is there are two reasons which made science an important issue for the Soviet government, and as a matter of fact, one of the main elements of self-identification, self-perception of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union describes itself as a country governed according to scientific principles. Yeah? So science is not just a marginal product of the Soviet society, it's the core element of the whole governance system of the Soviet Union. And this core element comes from two very different sources. One of them is the idea of Marxism as a scientific theory of social development. The word scientific should be emphasized. I don't know how many of you have ever heard this very famous statement, which every single student of social sciences or economics in the Soviet Union had to learn. Marx's teaching is all-powerful. Why is it all-powerful? Учение Маркса всесильно, потому что... Does anybody remember that, of those who speak Russian here? Because it's true. That's the explanation. Marx's teachings are all powerful because they are true. And what does true mean? They're scientifically proven. Okay? Soviet Union is the first example in the world of a state which has a solid scientific foundation. Science tells us how we govern. And because of that, one of the main goals of the new Soviet state is to massively encourage the spread of science and the importance of science in the society. By the way, again, very unlike paper states, right? Very different way of thinking about yourself. And that means education. Soviet Union has one of the most, and let's be honest about the successful examples of mass education in the last century within a short period of time. That means absolute rejection of religion, of superstition of any form. That means the development of a large sector of public science, of educational institutions. But that also means the whole allocation of resources in the country, supposedly according to scientific principles. And that is what the central planning is supposed to achieve. The typical argument of the Soviet ideologists of that era, well, actually of the Soviet Marxist scientists, let's call them how they would like to call them, is that if you look at their Western market economies, their market forces lead to some reallocation of goods and of services, and they are, of course, all wrong because nobody knows where things should go, while we rely on science. Science allows us to calculate exactly how the goods should be reallocated, and this exact recalculation of how the goods should be allocated makes it correct. So that's one source of the scientific, almost scientific fetish, if I'm allowed to use this word, of the Soviet government. Another source has a much more pragmatic reasons. That is the military competition with the West. At least from the pre-World War II era, and most certainly after World War II, after the nuclear project. Soviet government is very acutely aware of two things. First, scientific superiority is necessary to achieve military superiority. And second, and this is very important, military superiority is ultimately achieved not only through applied research, but also through fundamental scientific research. Essentially, at some point of time, the Soviet leadership had a clear understanding of what it believed to be a clear understanding, that if you want to have the new nuclear bomb or H-bomb or whatever, you need to let these people do what they want. And they will at some point of time produce a new nuclear bomb. This is a very important innovation, if you want, because this understanding of the importance, practical importance of basic scientific research is, as a matter of fact, not necessarily present even in the Western society. What was the outcome of that? Major military-industrial complex, which worked according to its old logic, which was, back to the original topic of my discussion, massively supported by the revenues from oil and gas, because, of course, military-industrial complex doesn't produce any economic value, and which ultimately determines its goals by itself. And this leads to something what I would call insulation of scientific community in the Soviet society, which creates a very specific situation, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So you have a country in which this scientific focus is at the center, but already this scientific idea, at least because of the existence of these two sources of attention to science in the Soviet society, immediately creates a major friction. And the nature of friction is very clear. Look, on the one hand, we have Marxism. Marxism is, as I said, scientifically correct, right? On the other hand, we have a need for nuclear bomb. And here comes a problem. It's also scientifically correct, but the scientific correctness needed for the nuclear bomb is obviously a different one from Marxism. Yeah? That means you need to lead people who will produce a nuclear bomb, operate in a way that they will be allowed to separate themselves and to encapsulate themselves from the ideological pressure, supposedly also scientific pressure, the rest of the Soviet society is constructed upon. You create a focus on science, which automatically means that another reason why you claim you are a scientifically governed country will come into disarray. And this is exactly what happens. And the first thing which this new, strong scientific community of the Soviet Union did after it emerged, and I think the moment of its flourishing is certainly the period after World War II, the 1960s, but in terms of the number of people and the salaries paid there, well continues in the 1970s and 1980s, it clearly emancipated itself from Marxism. I think the famous quote of a Soviet Nobel laureate, Lev Landau, is here the most applicable one. And again, I will be challenged to translate it in English, because in English it will not sound as colorful as in Russian. Landau at some point of time talks about natural sciences and unnatural sciences. And the Russian unnatural is противоестественный. And those who speak Russian will recognize this word. It's not just unnatural in the sense not natural. It's the opposite to natural in the sense of right and correct. And this is, of course, not necessarily an argument against the cultural studies or literature studies. That's an argument against Marxism and social sciences. Everything what, according to the physicists of that era, has absolutely no scientific foundation, although it claims to be science. So let's briefly look at this community of physicists, and primarily of physicists and mathematicians, who create this impression of Soviet Union being a scientific superpower in the West. And here I have a photo from a Soviet movie. I don't know how many recognize it. You do, of course. It's a very, very famous Soviet movie. Actually, you can watch it in Germany on DVD with German subtitles if you don't speak Russian. Who knows this picture? Wow. I mean, that shows how our student body changes, I guess.
Studies here to change that.
Very good. So this guy, but who do you think this guy is? As in terms of profession? It's a physicist, of course. Yeah. Soviet, the movie is called The 9 Days of 1 Year. And it is a story of a physicist, and I'm kind of simplifying the whole story, taking away a very romantic image of this physicist presented there. It's a person who, at the beginning of the movie, observes his scientific supervisor dying as a consequence of an experiment, which obviously has no meaning. And there's no explanation why you do this experiment. And then throughout the whole movie, this guy destroys his life, his relationship, and ultimately also suffers from most likely lethal dose of radiation to repeat the same experiment. And most likely he's going to die. We don't know it exactly, it's not shown clearly. He's doing it not for the greatness of the country. We have earlier Soviet movies from the 1930s where similar persona would say something about the great country we live in. Actually, this person never explains why he's doing that. The only justification provided in the movie at one moment of time, and very ironically, is that this person wants to a unit of physical measurement to be named under his name, and is disappointed that his name doesn't sound so nice, like Faraday or Ohm or whatever. But it's also made ironical. So what does the movie essentially claim? It tells that, first of all, science is an extremely noble endeavor without any practical importance or without the need to explicitly ask about the practical importance. There's a certain contradiction to the very nature of the Soviet planned economy, where at the end, you always have to have a practical importance. But if you look at the plot of this movie, this practical importance is always kind of assumed to happen anyway, if you just pursue the truth without any limits. And this person is obviously presented in the movie as somebody, I mean, this is a big distinction, I guess, to most Western scientific movies I know, American ones at least. In most of them, scientists are presented as, how should I put it, a bit eccentric. This person is not presented eccentric at all. He's presented as, if you want, an ideal in some sense. And this movie is the most famous one, but not the only one. And this very much summarizes the way how this scientific community defined itself and explained itself. It defined itself as a group of people who focus on science without actually thinking about why you want to go and focus on scientific investigation. Again, a famous quote of that era, the only goal of the science is to satisfy one's curiosity at the cost of the state. You don't need any other justification for that. It is a strictly egalitarian community. There is a famous book of that era which describes, a bit ironically, an ideal scientist, and one of the criteria is never wears a suit. Because, you know, that's not what real scientists do. They are just always casual because we think about the big picture, the great development of scientific community, but it's also meaning that there are no formal hierarchies in this system. Everybody's kind of at the same level. Everybody is part of the pursuit of the same truth. This egalitarianism in the Soviet scientific hierarchies, and this is very important, is not just a product of the imagination of these people. The Soviet state explicitly creates, and I think there is no analogy to this in international community, or even here in Germany, it's certainly not the case, a double hierarchy for scientists. There is a hierarchy which is a social, I mean, how typically hierarchy works in any organization. You work, and at some point of time, because you are good at doing what you do, you become a manager, and then you stop doing what you are good at, and instead start managing other people. And if you're very successful, you manage even more people and do even less of what you're actually good at. Soviet Union explicitly creates a double hierarchy in science. You could become a head of a laboratory, you could become a head of the institute, you could become a head of a division, or you could become the senior research fellow. And then, unfortunately, there are three words, all of them in Russian mean senior, translated in English. So then you again become a senior research fellow, the leading, ведущий. And then you become an even more senior research fellow, the so-called главный научный сотрудник. And your salary as this most senior research fellow is equivalent to the salary of the head of the institute you're working in. So essentially, you have the right to advance in rank, in status, in salary, without any administrative responsibilities. I think we would dream of that, I guess. But the Soviet Union created that for its scientists. On top of that, and I think this is very important again for our big question, why the Soviet Union was perceived as a scientific superpower. This community clearly sees itself as part of the global scientific community. It doesn't separate itself from the global scientific debate. It wants to be part of the global scientific debate. Soviet scientists undertake enormous effort to publish in international journals, to go to international conferences, to talk to their Western colleagues. This type of interaction, which is of course through multiple tools constrained by the Soviet state, is perceived as part of their own ethos and some sort of general idea of all scientists in the world sharing the same progressive worldview. Which is of course something where the Western observers very much respond to, because they find out that these are the people who are very active behind the Iron Curtain, and that means that the Soviet Union is most likely not a state in which science plays a very important role. And ultimately, this community clearly rejects any form of ideological governmental interventions. Again, I'm going to tell you a most likely never happening historical anecdote. I mean, most likely it never happened, okay? But the fact that it was repeated so often demonstrates you the self-perception of this community. After Andrei Sakharov published his famous letter to the head of the Soviet state, and the prosecution against him started, he was stripped of all ranks, and one of the ranks he had to be stripped of was the membership in the Soviet Academy of Sciences, which, by the way, he received after because of his contribution to the construction of the Soviet H-bomb. And according to this legend, when the discussion of excluding Sakharov from the Academy of Sciences starts, the debate goes as follows. Somebody says, you know, it's an absolutely unprecedented decision we want to make now. And then one of the members of the Academy stands up and says, you know, that's not unprecedented at all. There was already a precedent. Einstein was expelled from the Berlin Academy of Sciences under Nazis. And then the discussion stops, and Sakharov actually remains member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Now, why is this historical anecdote most likely wrong? Because the Soviet Union had multiple cases of people expelled from the Soviet Academy of Sciences under Stalin. However, it doesn't matter. In this case, the whole story demonstrates the idea of the science of being able to distance itself from the political and ideological discourse, which, and again, I have to highlight it one more time, also defined itself as scientific one. Yeah? All right. And maybe the final part about the scientific superpower of the Soviet Union, this community, maybe due to the reasons I described here, maybe due to this movie and similar movies, and maybe due to very high salaries. Soviet scientists were paid quite substantial money, especially compared to the level of the freedoms they enjoyed in their job. Was among the most attractive career pathways for Soviet citizens. So a lot of people wanted to make career in this area, also partly because many other career paths were simply closed in the country. They didn't exist at all. And here comes the main problem. This type of scientific community was based on rejection of the notion of scientific Marxism, the scientific foundation of the state. Not open rejection, of course. It would be unacceptable for the ideological foundation of the Soviet Union, but some sort of hidden rejection. If you want, the right not to take it seriously. But at the same time, this community was clearly and closely linked to the state. The state which was paying money to these people, and what's most important, the state which allowed these people to pursue their own curiosity without any form of responsibility. So this ideal of a chief scientific fellow, главный научный сотрудник, earning a lot of money with zero tasks, just pursuing what this person wants to enjoy, is obviously impossible without enormous inflow of petrodollars in the Soviet economy. And this link, at some point of time, becomes a problem not just for the official Marxist part of science, but also for this technocratic community. Because the Soviet society also perceives itself as part of the state and of the state propaganda. So it wants to emancipate from itself from the state, but it's still linked to state in sufficient extent, and the Soviet society starts to reject it. And we observe it at least starting from the 1980s, and there is a recent book investigating that in really great detail, in the growing religiosity in the Soviet Union, but also the growing beliefs in the paranormal. And you can very nicely trace how from scientific debates of the 1960s, you end up with some very strange esoteric thoughts of the 1980s, which are clearly rejected by science in any form, which reject science as such, but which are kind of slow movement away from what people perceive to be official state-sponsored science. So you see, what at some point of time was a liberating move against ideological Marxism is now official state-sponsored science. And that essentially means the end to the whole structure of the Soviet Union's scientific superpower, because at the moment when the Soviet Union ceases to exist, the first thing which happens, these people stop receiving substantial governmental subsidies. It's ironic, because many of these people were among the most active supporters of reforms in the Soviet Union, and they are among the first to suffer. And simultaneously, Soviet society has zero respect and zero understanding to these people. So they massively lose their status. And I think it is ironic, it's twice ironic. There are those who debate why the Russian Empire, the supposedly highly orthodox society, showed so little resistance to the prosecution of clergy by the communist regime. And here you have the same. The new society, which grew out of supposedly highly scientific Soviet Union, really didn't care about science in any way. So, the summary of my argument for the first two problems is Soviet Union appeared to be a technological scientific superpower. Both of that were artifacts of very specific way how the planned economy was organized and of the incentives which the planned economy created. So both of them were purchased by massive interventions in the economy and social life, and ultimately through petrodollars. So if you want, the scientific Soviet Union was similarly a sandcastle to the industrial Soviet Union, and the foundation was the energy empire one. And now let me come to my third question. And the third question is, why didn't the research of the late 1980s and early 1990s notice that? And here I'm going to quote Andrei Schläfer and Daniel Triesman. I mean, at least some of the students in this audience know that because they had to read the paper in my class, but not all of them, not all of you. So, Schläfer and Triesman asked the question, why did people expect more from the Soviet Union than the Soviet Union actually delivered? I have this nice quote. Many Western observers started with a basic misconception. They believed that, as of the early 1990s, Russia was a highly developed, if not wealthy country. With its brilliant physicists and chess players, its space program and its global military influence, Russia didn't look like a typical middle-income country, which it in reality was. So the question we need to ask is, why didn't the giant industry of studying Russia, which existed at that moment of time in Western Europe and in the United States not notice that they are studying not a technologically sophisticated scientific superpower, but a petrostate, which was able to purchase, because of sufficient energy incomes, this type of superstructure. And this reveals, in my opinion, the need of a very interesting dialogue about how the Soviet Union is studied and how fundamentally you study societies of this sort, as well as how, generally speaking, the area studies can be constructed. And here, for me, the most important argument comes from a piece written by Schlappentop, a former Soviet intellectual who at some point of time fled to the United States, got a professorship there, published a lot of work, but obviously felt not welcome by the American Sovietological community. And indeed, his own theoretical work is something what I would personally not subscribe to, his everyday totalitarianism idea. But ultimately wrote a paper about American Sovietology, which made two very important arguments. Argument number one, the whole American Sovietology was based on the idea of the Soviet Union being something very special. That was the starting premise of the whole research, and he puts it in the categories of abnormal or supernormal. Supernormal Soviet Union existed for Marxists and for left-wing intellectuals who believe that's the society we need to look at to understand how different world order could function, which is not organized based on the principles of the market economies and capitalism. An abnormal idea comes back to a concept you all know, totalitarianism research. Totalitarian societies are believed to be a very small subgroup of societies with absolute control over people's life, and because of that, they are kind of an aberration on the main line of the development of societies in the world. So if you start talking about Soviet Union by claiming our topic of investigation is not like the others, you should not be surprised if you're not going to see where your topic of investigation is exactly like the others. Specifically in the economic foundation depending on the export of energy to the world markets. Another point which Schlappentop makes, and this is a very important part, I think, of any area studies debate, and I'm sure it will be important for many classes in our program here. Big part of area studies are ultimately not about the region they study, but about the country in which people live, who study this region. A lot of Sovietologists wrote their texts about Soviet Union, but what they had in mind was not the Soviet Union, it was the United States, which they wanted to criticize, to reflect upon, to discuss. That's not a unique feature of the US or Western Europe. We observe the same in Russia. Russian area studies, for example, Russian sinology, is very much about seeing Russia in the eyes of the other, of China, and defining itself by studying China and by defining what's different in China from how we are. But in any case, if you have this type of perception of the country, you may end up focusing not on what you're going to focus. You remember, we had debates in the US about the growth of the military-industrial complex, about the role of science in the society, the technocratic ideas. That's also the 1950s and the 1960s in the United States. I don't know how many of you remember the concept, which at some point of time was very popular one, the convergence thesis, claiming that both Soviet Union and the United States transform themselves into bureaucratic societies which ultimately will become the same. So these are all arguments about John Kenneth Galbraith. These are all arguments about the United States. But if you want to make an argument about the United States having a certain position in the American intellectual discourse, you end up focusing on specific aspects of what you want to focus at by looking at the Soviet Union. And as a result, the focus on industrial capacity, on the scientific superpower of the Soviet Union, became much more important than energy aspects. And then there's, of course, another feature of the Cold War Sovietology, its close links to the state, which is studying Soviet Union as a threat. And what does it mean to study Soviet Union as a threat? To know how many tanks can they produce, how many nuclear weapons they can do, how threatening they are for us. And for this, you really need to know their industrial capacity and the scientific potential directly translating in this industrial capacity. So all of that led to a focus which possibly would have been very different if one, from the start, tried to compare the Soviet Union to maybe entirely different societies and tried to focus on the basics of the functioning of this type of economies, which would turn out to be very different in terms of the conclusions. So let me sum up some lessons learned, and then we'll have enough time for questions and discussion. First of all, I think I was able to demonstrate to you this peculiar situation which existed 30 years ago. We had a country, Soviet Union, which was not perceived as a petrostate, and it was not perceived as a petrostate precisely because it was a petrostate. It used the resources it received in somewhat different way than other petrostates do. What in Nigeria or in Venezuela manifests itself in luxury palaces of the presidents or cars, expensive cars on the streets of the capital, where you have an oil bonanza, in the Soviet Union manifested itself in free-thinking physicists and chemists and major industrial capacity, which was ultimately serving the Soviet military and was entirely uncompetitive in any free market economy. Western scholars failed to recognize it because their research of the Soviet Union was massively driven by the specific assumptions. They looked at what they wanted to look, and that's what they ultimately found. They found industrial capacity, they found Soviet sites. They didn't find the energy foundation of all that. And that's unfortunately a very sad conclusion, which tells us accumulation of empirical knowledge doesn't necessarily is the way out of any challenge if you want to study a certain country, because if you accumulate the knowledge through a specific lens, you will end up seeing only part of the picture. And here, those who looked at the Soviet society from more general, theoretical perspectives could have been more successful. However, and this is also very important for me, that's not the end of the story. Because this technological Soviet Union, not at all energy-dependent Soviet Union, in a sense continues to exist. It continues to exist as an ideational concept, which is, however, extremely powerful in the political debate in Russia, but also in some other countries of the post-Soviet Eurasia. This ideational concept started from the very beginning in the 1990s. So you look at many people who are disappointed by how transition looks like. They're disappointed by the major decline of revenue the country has. Post-Soviet transition recession was one of the deepest ones in the whole socialist bloc. They are disappointed by the loss of their social status. You have a situation when you, within a couple of years, are degraded from a highly respected intellectual with the right to explore the world to somebody who is, well, in the lowest group of the income hierarchy. And they are disappointed in terms of how their country is perceived in the world. Because all of a sudden, also people from outside don't look at Russia now, the Soviet Union is gone, not as a technological, scientific center, which will at some point of time show the way to the future, or at least is very threatening, but at an energy state. Dependent on energy, corruption, oligarchy, everything would be typically combined with the concept of petrostate and energy dependence in political science and economics. And that is obviously a very good foundation for ressentiment. And this logic leads to what Vladimir Gelman and Nastasia Rudenko in a very recent paper published a couple of months ago call the myth of the good Soviet Union. The argument that, of course, there were parts of the Soviet economy which didn't function. The planned economy was obviously wrong. The deficit of consumer goods, low quality of services is of course highly problematic. It shouldn't have been there. But the most important thing, it was possible for us to create a competitive industry and a technological potential which was respected and feared throughout the world. And that means we could go back there and we could actually replicate the good Soviet Union without the problems of the Soviet Union of that era. And I'm talking about this good Soviet Union as a very important political concept, while at the beginning the good Soviet Union was part of the rhetoric of the oppositional forces in Russia, specifically Communist Party. At least for the last 1.5 decades, I'd say, maybe not from the very beginning, but for sure since mid-first decade of the 2000s. The good Soviet Union is a very important part of Putin's rhetoric and ideology, if I may talk about ideology of Putin regime at all. While Putin's regime clearly doesn't embrace all aspects of the Soviet Union, for example, it's very much keen at maintaining market economy and economic liberalism, the good Soviet Union, which we lost by historical coincidence, ultimately is believed to be something worthwhile and something that one should try to replicate. So if you want, the fact that already at that moment of time, this good Soviet Union stood, not the good Soviet Union, the real Soviet Union, good and bad, stood on very shaky energy foundation, is something which is still not perceived in the debates. And when I was preparing for this lecture, I actually screened through quite a number of Russian language publications of the last years, all united with the same topic. They all wanted to prove that Soviet Union was not energy dependent. And invested enormous effort in that, extremely rich material in terms of statistics. So actually I used some of that today. But all ended with a quote, I mean, one of the articles was particularly impressive, saying that we all understand who is saying that Soviet Union was energy dependent and what these people actually want to achieve. Yeah? So, the great misperception, if you want, of the late Soviet Union is a fact of political realities in modern Russia. And it plays a particular role. So here I'd like to stop, and we have 20 minutes for questions and discussion. Thank you very much.